the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Love Meat Bread. Today on Love Meat Bread, we are going back to basics and making my traditional challah recipe. And for those of you who are not joining us for the first time, you know exactly what this entails. So let's get started. So first, we are going to need to make our yeast mixture. I have 6 ounces of water here, about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Additionally, I have a scant tablespoon, that means just less than a tablespoon, of active dry yeast. And I also have just about a tablespoon of white granulated sugar. So we are just going to lovingly pour that over here. Give it a quick mix in. Now remember that this is not going to totally dissolve, so don't expect it to. Just going to take our fork here and we're going to lightly fluff it with the tines of our fork. Just swirl it around in there just a little bit until some of the sugar dissolves. Remember, the yeast is not going to dissolve all the way. And at this point, if you want to set a timer, you can set a timer between 5 minutes and 20 minutes. Really, it just kind of depends on how active you think your yeast is going to be. I'm not going to set a timer because hopefully by the time everything else we do is done, this will bloom up nice and lightly. Cover it just to make sure we keep all that nice heat in there. And let's start preparing our liquid ingredients. So in this container, I have another 6 ounces of water. This is at room temperature. If you're taking yours straight out of the fridge, you just want to microwave it for 30 seconds and let it sit. It'll come a little bit above room temperature, but really that's okay. And actually, if your water's a little warm, that's not that big a deal because you might be using eggs that are fresh out of the fridge. And so if you are, and if you didn't bring them to room temperature ahead of time, keeping your water a little bit on the warm side is just going to make sure that everything kind of gets to a room temperature level when it needs to be. So speaking of eggs, I have 2 whole large eggs and 1 egg yolk in here. I'm just going to mix these together real quick and add them in to our water. You want to do the mixing of this before, if you can. You're going to mix it once it's in, but it's more difficult to get at the yolks and to mix all the egg together if you don't mix it separately. So that's why I mix it in this first and then pour it in my water. All right, so there's our eggs and our water together. And we're just going to mix these real quick as well. All right, so the next thing we need to put in is our oil. I have 7 tablespoons of vegetable oil, canola oil. Really any type of neutral oil will work fine. Obviously, keep allergies and things in mind. All right. Almost dropped that. That would have been bad. And then finally, our sweetener. We have 7 tablespoons of honey. This is just regular grocery store honey, so nothing special there. Particularly if you have specialty honey or you have a nice flavored honey, what that is going to do is just slightly change the sweet flavor of your bread. So you are always welcome to use a nicer honey, to use a flavored honey, just keeping in mind that it will alter the flavor of the bread, which can be a really nice thing. Not a couple weeks back, a little while back, my father keeps bees, so I was using honey from the family bees, and it gave a nice little hint, a little floral hint to my bread. So I highly encourage you to use specialty honey if you can. Obviously, I'm not doing that today, so no pressure. But it does give your flavor nice little notes of other flavors, which can be nice if you're into that sort of thing. All right, we're just getting the rest of our honey off here. All right, we're just going to mix our liquid ingredients together a little bit here before we start to prepare our solid ingredients, our dry ingredients. Oh, I said solid ingredients. That's all right. Alrighty, so And by the way, if this starts to separate, right, oil and water, no big deal. Just keep your fork in here. You can always stir it again. No worries about that. Okay. I'm just going to set this off to the side here just for a moment. Meanwhile, I have 5½ cups of bread flour here. You can use all-purpose, but I like bread because it's a little, it has a higher gluten content and it makes the bread a little chewier. If you don't like chewy bread, you do not need to use it. And we're going to mix into there just a touch of salt. I free pour my salt, but if you want a measurement, about a tablespoon will do. You do not need to use a whole tablespoon. You can use as little as a teaspoon. The salt is just kind of adding to the flavor of the bread, keeping it a little savory. So no worries there. You can do whatever makes you happy. All right, so I'm just going to use a whisk here to combine our salt and our flour. This is going to do two things. One, of course, it is going to just combine those two ingredients, but because I'm using a whisk, it's also going to kind of sift the flour, right? It's going to give us a more even bit of flour here, so and get rid of some of the clumps. That's what I meant to say. It'll get rid of some of the clumps in the flour, so you'll have a smoother flour to work with. And it'll just take a second to do that. Everything will pretty much get mixed in together, so don't worry too much if you can't see your salt granules or what have you. It's all in there. All right. So once you've done that, we are going to take our hands or your whisk, or if you're doing this on a board here, you're going to make your little well like we've done in the past. I may yet do that in another episode. It was almost a disaster the first episode when I did it, so I have been really reticent to go back to doing it. So we're just going to use our hands and just create a little well. So just put your hands in your flour mixture here and just create a little hole, actually a pretty deep hole, and just push your dry ingredients up against the side of your bowl. And we are going to pour our wet ingredients into here. But before we do that, we need to check on our yeast. So how's our yeast doing? Oh, look at that. So you can actually see on camera here, let me just make sure you can see. Yep. So there's a liquid bit and then there's a lighter colored foam bit here. And once you have that foam bit, regardless of what your timer says, you're good. Remember, this process is just to prove, here, let's see, just to prove that the yeast is alive and active. So we're going to take our yeast mixture here and just pour it into our little well. And then once we've done that, we're going to give our wet ingredients just one final mix here. Just make sure we don't separate that oil and water too much. And we're just going to pour that in as well. Now I'm going to use my whisk just to get this started. If you don't have a whisk, or you want to use your hands, you want to use a spoon or whatever, that's just fine. You can do that. It's not a big deal. All right, so I'm gonna start in the middle here, just stirring just enough so that some of the flour comes in. If you're using a spoon and you're in a large enough bowl, you're not worried about spilling like I am. You can start to use your spoon, just bring in some of the liquid from the wall. So you can see that my liquid is really high in my bowl here, so I'm just being a little careful about how I start to incorporate that. Eventually, you will not be able to use a whisk for this any longer, at least without it being a giant pain. So you will have to use your hands or a spoon. I like using my hands. I find it makes it, I find it's, it's more cathartic. Well, it's just more fun. So you're just going to keep stirring it around in here with all your dry ingredients until you get to a point where doing so becomes difficult. Your bread dough should be about a banana bread consistency, kind of a battery type of consistency here. And then once you're there, you really want to start mixing in the rest of the flour. And just again, I'm using a whisk. You can see I've got lots of stuff in my whisk now. So just be careful, or else you'll be fishing that out later, which I'm probably going to be. That's okay. So once your mixing here is done and you have a dough that has incorporated most of the flour from your dry ingredients into your wet ingredients. And you get a dough that's more or less one mass that you can pick up with your hands. We're going to transfer that onto our bowl. Sorry, out of our bowl onto our work surface. Sorry about that. Can't speak this morning. Afternoon even. All right, so we're almost there. You can see I've got a large dough mass, but you can also see that I've got a lot of flour left over here. So we're just going to keep mixing that together until it's where we want it. If you're doing this in a stand mixer, there is no need to transfer any of your ingredients out of your stand mixer. You can actually use the stand mixer to knead it. I recommend starting on a low setting, like stir, until it is clear that your standing mixer is not going to be able to perform that function any longer. It will start to give what sounds like a groan. And once you hear that sound, you just want to turn the speed up on your mixer to like 2. Again, you're going to be, the best test you have for your bread there is going to be listening to it. Once it seems like that speed is no longer cutting it, you're just going to whip it up to the next speed. Word of caution that I always give when I'm recommending people use standing mixers, it is possible to over knead your bread if you have it in a standing mixer. So just always a warning about that. It is almost impossible to do that if you are working with bread dough by hand. So not really an issue there for us since we're making a bowl today. But if I'm using it in a mixer, you definitely want to set a timer. No matter what happens, you really don't want it going longer than 10 minutes. You will over knead your dough, which is going to be really problematic in the way it proofs and bakes. That just won't be as nice. And it won't have that nice consistency that we're so used to having on the show. So you always want to make sure of that. All right, so you can see now I'm realizing the folly of using a whisk because I'm now going to use my fingers to get all this out. That's all right. If you were smart enough to use a spoon, feel free to tease me in the chat or the comments. I will be better next week, I'm sure. All right, so once you have solved your whisk problem or you are ready to put it on the thing, on your board, just give me a second here. This is not the most graceful looking part of the show by a long shot, but necessary. We want to get all that dough in the bowl. All right. I think we're done with you, Mr. Whisk. Yeah. Let's just put that in the sink. One last bit of dough. There we go. All right. So now we still have some flour left in here, so just use your hands. Mix it around. The dough should feel soft, but it should incorporate all the flour. This part, by the way, you don't have to do in the bowl. I'm doing it in the bowl to kind of keep things neat. But at this point, because I'm semi-kneading it, you can put it on your work surface here. But you can see I'm just moving it around a little bit, trying to incorporate the remainder of the flour. But if it's easier for you to do it on the work surface, do it on the work surface, no big deal. And actually, it's mostly one giant mass. So we are going to turn ours out onto our work surface. Okay. Ooh, so there's a little bit of flour in there. Just use your hand and just get the rest of that out. We will inevitably end up adding flour to this, but we put the flour in here. We should use it. And just make sure you get out as much of that as you possibly can. Best tool for this, obviously, is just your fingers. But if you have a spatula or something, you think you can do a better job with that, I encourage you to use whatever tools you have. But if you only have the tools that you were born with, then feel free to use those too. All right. All right. So pretty much got all the flour out of that. So there's a tiny bit left, but it's not a big deal. All right. So now we're just going to knead a little bit and just get the rest of this incorporated. Knead however you want. One hand, two hand, Slap method, which again, I haven't taught on this show because I don't have a lapel mic yet. I'm hoping to get one soon. And then we can do the slap method together, and you won't just hear a really loud sound with that. As I need here, I have some good news that's not politics related. I don't want to give anything away just yet because nothing's really confirmed, but Let Them Eat Bread is going to have its first guests on the show, hopefully within the next 2 weeks. I don't want to give away who they are or what we are talking about with them, but I do just want to tell you that the show will be a little different, and it'll be a little different for me too, because we are not going to be making bread on those episodes. We're going to be bringing in different types of foods, still basics, cultural basics that I think are important for people to know how to make in an easy and accessible way, but aren't necessarily bread. So special treat coming up. And actually, if these episodes go well and they're popular, maybe we'll start to bring other foods and other guests on the show. There are definitely people who I want to talk to on the show about a variety of topics, and I'm very excited for that. So if these shows with guests go really well, I would love to keep doing that. Obviously, we'll have our sessions together, and we'll still keep talking about our politics and our essentials here. But to the extent that we can mix the show up a little bit and make things a little bit more exciting and novel, I'm always open to suggestions. So to that end, if you have a bread recipe that you want to see on the show, or even a non-bread recipe that you think is just kind of a cultural staple and essential food that's easy to learn how to make, even if it's not necessarily easy to make, let me know. I will do some research, I will find out how to make it, and we will make it on the show together. Whether I make it with a guest or on my own, it doesn't really matter, we will figure it out. But I'm excited that the show is taking a little bit of a turn in our 18th and 19th weeks, next 2 weeks. And so yeah, if you are watching those shows, please just tell me what you think. I would be really interested to know if that would be good, if there's something else that you feel would make the show more interesting. Obviously, let me know, and we can see what we can do about that. All right, you can see I've just added about a 1/4 cup of flour here. I usually say you do an 1/8 cup, but my dough is very wet right now. Still nice and soft though, so I just want to make sure you're maintaining that nice softness. And just keep kneading. If you're in your standing mixer, please stop the mixer before you add flour, or else the flour will go everywhere and it will not be nice. But if you're on a tray or a table, or just another work surface, or even if you're kneading in a bowl, no need to stop kneading. You can just add the flour as you go, as I've done here. And if you're not watching for the first time, you know that the drill is to keep kneading until you have a bread that can pass the window pane test. As you may know, there are lots of different ways you can tell if your bread is finished being kneaded, but the one that I find is the most tried and true, the easiest to do and replicate, and the one that has never failed me is the window pane test, and that is the one that we do. If you're watching for the first time, I will show you what that means, so don't worry. No need to open up Google or anything, just keep kneading your bread until it is the proper consistency and kneadingness. Speaking of consistency, what are we looking for? As always, we are looking for tacky and not sticky. We want it to feel like it's got some stick to it, but we don't want it to stick to your hands when you put your hands on it. And when you're working with it, you don't want the dough to end up in a position where it's sticking all over your fingers. It's too liquidy at that point. And the dough will actually become more tacky as you work it to an extent. So that's why we add flour, to dry it out a little bit and to absorb some, and to add to the dough, because the gluten will expand and make it tacky. So we're just kind of fighting that a little bit, but not too much, right? We want to strike a very intricate balance between the amount of dry ingredient we add to our loaf while we're kneading it, and also we want to maintain that nice softness, and we want to get to a point where it's where it is all three: soft, tacky, and has well-developed gluten. All right. It's starting to feel pretty good. I think I'm going to try and work in this last little bit of flour here, and then we'll give it a check. We'll see if it's ready. I think it's probably ready. Could be wrong though. I mean, I've only been kneading for 5 or 6 minutes, so maybe not. But you never know. So it's always good just to check. And by the way, again, as I said earlier, it's almost impossible to over-knead if you're doing it by hand. So, if you have to check 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, doesn't matter. Now, if you're doing it in a machine or you're using electronics or something else, or a bread maker or what have you, to knead your bread for you, you want to be more vigilant about checking it because it can go overboard. And if it does, it will not rise properly. And if it does not rise properly, it will not bake properly. So, all right. So I have a nice tacky bread. I'm just turning it into a ball. For those who have not been on with the show before, we're putting our hands in a cupping motion. We're slipping those underneath our bread, and we're using the tackiness of the bread to keep it more or less in the same spot. But you'll start to see that the top of the bread will tighten. It'll get more taut, and you will get to a place where we have a nice ball. And so the reason we're using a cup motion, one is just to keep the shape of the ball in a circle, but also to keep tucking in parts of the bread underneath itself so that the dough actually gets more taut. Because if we just do this, it's not really needed taut. We have to do it this way in order to make sure we're taking advantage of the natural tackiness of the dough and sliding the bread underneath itself so that it gets nice and taut. All right, so here's our bread. We're just going to take a little corner of it here. Oh, this feels really good. I'm very confident, guys. All right. So now that you got your little piece of bread, take your fingers and your thumbs, and we're going to start to spread it out slowly, a little bit at a time, until it's like spreading out a pizza almost. You're just going to spread it out a little bit until it's nice and thin. Don't spread it out too much at once. The whole purpose of this exercise is not to rip the dough, but to get it as thin as possible in a way that allows it to demonstrate how much gluten has developed. So if you're finding it's getting really thin and you're worried about it breaking, what you want to do is you want to take your bread dough and you want to put it up to a light source. And if you can see the light coming through it and it hasn't broken, it's ready, and ours is. Can you see? Yeah, you should be able to see. Okay. So this is done, ready to rise. So once again, we're just going to put that back in there. We're going to re-roll our ball of dough until it's nice and taut. And if you want, because we're going to take a second to do something else, just take a little pinch of flour, put it down, and that's going to stop our dough from sticking to the work surface. It should come up nice and easy. So just take a little pinch. There you go. All right, so that should come up nice and easy. So now what we're going to do is we're going to prepare our bread for rising. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to get a large bowl. We're going to take a tiny bit of oil. If you want a measurement, we're looking for like a teaspoon or less. I like to free pour mine, but you don't have to. So start with half a teaspoon, work your way up to a teaspoon. You really don't need a lot of oil. Obviously, if you have a larger bowl, you are going to need more oil. But we're just going to take our oil, slowly move it around the bowl here. And then once it's done that, you're just going to take your hands or a napkin, and you're going to create a very thin layer of oil, just enough so that our bread dough does not stick to the bowl when we are rising it. Okay. Again, this should not take much oil at all. If you've got too much oil in here, and you'll know because you'll have a big pool of it at the bottom, just use a napkin or a paper towel or something to get rid of that extra oil. We don't want to be adding too much liquid to our bread via this method, which is why I say to use so little. But you do want to have a little bit cooling at the bottom, because what we're going to do now, thank you, bread, so we're going to put it in the bowl and we're just going to turn it a few times to make sure that it is covered in oil. This is going to keep the moisture in of our bread and allow it to rise nice and evenly. If it dries out, it will not rise. So what happens is, effectively, it forms a little bit of a crust on top, and that crust prevents any further rising. So the reason we cover it in just a light amount of oil here is just to make sure that that does not happen. So I'm going to wipe my hands down real quick, and then I'm going to put a little piece of plastic over this. If you have reusable plastic, I highly recommend you use that. If you have a lid, put it on, but don't put it on tightly, because the gas is going to be generated, carbon dioxide will be generated by the rising process, and it will pop your lid right off or break your bowl. We don't really want that. So let's, I'm gonna put some plastic wrap on here, and then I'm gonna put a tea towel on top just to keep the warmth in. All right. I also find that plastic wrap is just kind of the easiest to work with, but it is not very sustainable. So if you have a more sustainable option, I highly recommend you use it. And don't worry, we're going to use this plastic pretty much as we can for this bread. So it's not like it's going to necessarily go to waste. All right. Nope, we'll use plastic there. Let's just put it there so I can throw it out later. All right. So our bread is covered. Well, it's sealed in the bowl. Cover it with a tea towel here. Don't worry, it's not going to touch the bread. I am going to have to wash my hands, though. That's okay. All right, so we're just going to sit this here. We're going to set us a timer for 1 hour. If you are staying for the politics portion, we'll be back in a minute to see what's on the whiteboard. If you are not staying for the politics portion, then I will see you in approximately 1 hour when we come back to shape our bread. And actually, stick around for that, because I am going to be showing you a new way to knead your challah today. So I'm very excited about that, and we will do that in about an hour. So if you're not staying with us, I will see you later. If you are staying with us, I will be right back after just washing my hands and preparing this. All right, set your timers for an hour, and let's get going. Alrighty, thanks for your patience. I don't see anything on the chat, so let's go right into the whiteboard and see what is on the whiteboard for today. If you have questions about any of these topics, feel free to leave a chat or a comment, either in this video or on the subsequent cutouts that will come out on Monday. But let's get started. So, if you didn't know, the federal eviction moratorium expires today. I literally checked about 20 minutes before I started shooting just to make sure that there was not a deal in Congress to save that, but there wasn't. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about the eviction moratorium, what it was, what it meant, what was wrong with it, and then we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about what it means now that it's gone away. Okay? So first, the eviction moratorium is what was put in place by the Centers for Disease Control, and this effectively was under their authority. So the CDC has this authority to kind of institute these eviction moratoria if there's a national health emergency, right? Effectively, we can say, hey, there's an issue like, I don't know, a global pandemic that is, it would make forcing people out of their homes particularly dangerous. Now, I would argue forcing people out of their homes for any reason at any time is particularly dangerous, but, you know, let's set an argument in front of the day. So they, you know, put this into effect, which effectively meant that with very rare exception, you could not be evicted from your home, or if you're a renter, and if you are a homeowner, you couldn't be foreclosed out of your home during this time, right? So this was great in theory, right? So it stopped all these people who had just been laid off from being kicked out for non-payment of rent and other stuff like that. So that was put in place September 4th, 2020. And so it's coming up on a year, or it would have been coming up on a year just next month. Sorry, not next month, August, but next month, September. And I mean, for the most part, it was pretty good, right? So people could, you know, they had somewhere to stay, that they could quarantine, right? A lot of us were told to work from home if we could, to stay away from other people to prevent either spreading the disease that we've contracted, or to, you know, or catching the disease, you know, from other people. So it was very important as part of the federal government's plan to get this moving in this way, okay? And by the way, this isn't a partisan thing, right? The Trump administration put this in place. The Biden administration was extending it. Now, originally, I believe it was supposed to go to the end of June, but it had been extended. Now, what had happened was, the plan was to extend it an additional time, I think to the end of August, or to the end of the year. I don't really remember what the actual plan was supposed to be, but there was a plan to extend it. But the Supreme Court, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court pretty much said the CDC doesn't have the authority to do that. So President Biden essentially said to Congress, hey guys, like, I need you to pass a law saying that, you know, I can pass eviction moratoriums or eviction moratoria or whatever, that I can extend it. Well, they didn't. So now there were some problems with the eviction moratoria. The largest one was that all it really stopped people from doing was physically kicking people out of their homes. Landlords and banks could still file foreclosure and eviction proceedings. They could actually do all the paperwork ahead of time, but those cases couldn't be processed in courts. Now, I have a friend of mine who works in the court system who tells me that there are lots of evictions just waiting to go through. And now, because it's expired, on Monday, these claims are going to start to process, right? Unless individual states do things in order to make sure that this can't go forward any longer, because we are in fact still in a global pandemic. But the main issue here, as you can see, was that this wasn't actually stopping people from filing evictions, from filing foreclosure actions in courts, but it just said, hey, the court can't act on it. So essentially, we are very much in the running for an incredible wave of houselessness and homelessness going on fairly soon, because people have not been paying rent. Rent was not frozen. Rent was still due to the extent that you could pay it. And there was no real mechanism to help people out. Now, there is federal money out there that people should be able to use to help themselves. But according to recent reporting out of the federal government, this process has moved incredibly slowly. Landlords have not gotten this money. Banks have not gotten this money. Tenants and owners haven't gotten this money. So there's lots of slowdown. The requests are being processed at a very slow rate. There was recently a congressional hearing about it that talked a little bit about, you know, why things were going so slow. And the reaction of the department was, yeah, it's slow, but we're moving faster than we were. So it's like, you know, it's a faster snail, not just any old snail. It's a racing snail, I guess. But so this was, you know, this created all sorts of problems. One, landlords still had to pay their property taxes. They still had to pay their mortgages for their buildings, right, to banks. Individuals still had to pay their mortgages. So, you know, we have the ability to freeze all those payments to make it so that back rent wasn't due, and just to alleviate all this. But we didn't. We just said you can't actually kick people out. So people are still suffering. And not that I'm on the side of banks and landlords per se, but they do owe money to someone else, right? A lot of what rent goes to, other than their pockets directly, is they're paying someone else, and the banks are paying back the federal government who lent them the money, and there's a whole cycle of someone paying someone else. Okay, which is why the original moratorium was not particularly powerful. All it did was it kept you physically in the space, but it didn't stop you from being kicked out like Monday, which is going to happen to lots of people unless Congress can get their shit together and do something very soon. Now, apparently, according to Politico, they did try to put a bill forth in Congress yesterday, but it was not. But you know, they weren't able to get the votes. So this is all obviously very frustrating, and I'm about to give you some of the information about why this is so frustrating, other than the fact that lots of people will lose their homes. But in my mind, Biden actually had an out here. He could have just said, by executive order, you can't evict anyone anymore. Now, was it legal for him to do that? Well, it doesn't seem like it was, and it's entirely possible that it wasn't. But if he does that, it's a show of strength. It's him saying, from a policy perspective, this is what I want to see, and it puts the onus on the courts to then be the bad guy and strike it down. Whereas Biden just kind of sat back and let the thing expire and said, oh, well, this has to be in Congress. No, dude, you have power. You have the ability to challenge the courts, to kind of go to the other side, to say, look, I'm going to do it whether you like it or not. Trump did this all the time. Now, was his stuff struck down? Yeah, it was, but it took a while to get through the courts. It took time for the courts to do this. And by the way, that if Biden had taken the same strategy, that is valuable time that people who cannot pay their back rent and cannot pay their back foreclosure bills or whatever, mortgage bills, have to figure something out. That's more time that people have to get jobs if they're looking for them, right? There's all these things that more time would give people. But right now, that just isn't an option that was considered. You know, it wasn't like, oh, well, I'm gonna swing for the fences and, you know, let the court be the bad guys who throw out lots of people, right? Because that could be a great pitch for Democrats to retain the White House, right? Hey, you know, if you put us back in the White House, we will put in just judges and justices that are not going to, that are going to make sure that these bills and executive orders that I put through are going to, you know, uphold these very basic things like not kicking people out of their homes during a pandemic. So it just frustrates me a lot to see Biden kind of capitulate right away and said, oh, like there's nothing I can do to throw up his hands. There is something you can do, man. You can challenge the way that things are. The way that precedent gets set in courts, for those of you who don't know, is through case law, right? So someone challenges something because they don't like it, right? Biden could have challenged the courts by saying, yeah, I know you said the CDC can't do it. Okay, fine. So I, as the president of the United States, am just going to say no evictions for, I don't know, ever. You know, it doesn't have to be ever, but you can say till the end of the pandemic, right? You can say, you know, until case counts in the United States reach a certain level or vaccines get to a certain level or whatever. You could have given some metric, you could have made it very narrowly tailored, and you could have forced the courts to kind of like wriggle around with the idea of, well, can he do this? Can he not do this? And by the way, all that takes time, right? A Supreme Court case, unless it's done in an emergency way, which something like this probably wouldn't be, could take months. You could give people 4 or 5 months to try and figure out their financial situation, work with their landlords, work with their banks to figure something out. But that's not what happened, okay? So I'm very frustrated about that. You know, I'm very frustrated that this didn't get a ton of coverage until very recently. Literally, I didn't see anyone reporting about this until a couple of days ago, where there was a sudden realization, oh shit, you know, tens of millions of people might get kicked out of their homes because these evictions can now be acted on. And it's not can be filed, because as I said earlier, they have been filed. There are stacks of evictions and foreclosures just waiting to go through the court systems. Now, luckily for the people who are, you know, on the defending side of these, the courts are still going very slowly. There is still, you know, pandemic restrictions in a lot of the courts. and things are moving fairly slowly, and the courts have an incredible backlog from other things too that weren't able to be processed through the pandemic. But this is just one more reason why Biden could have challenged it and said, I'm going to put something else in the courts. I'm going to put another stumbling block in there to stop people from getting evicted. So again, just very disappointed with the Biden administration on this, and very disappointed with congressional Democrats for not pulling this through. I mean, by the way, this is one more reason we need to get rid of the filibuster, but again, it's a conversation for another day. So what happens now, right? So a lot of these cases are in court right now, as I mentioned, and they're going to go through the eviction process. So if you are a tenant, most cities do not guarantee you some form of legal defense for your eviction. So oftentimes people who can barely make rent are being asked to hire attorneys. Now, sometimes there are great organizations out there like Community Legal Services or your city's equivalent that essentially does lawyering for people who can't afford lawyers, which is a super important thing, and they do really great work. But a lot of the times there aren't a ton of these attorneys around, and there aren't a ton of attorneys who can do pro bono work like this on such a grand scale. And by the way, it's strained even in the best of times, but now that we have literally tens of millions of evictions and foreclosures pending, it's going to be really difficult for people to do that. Now, some cities, I believe New York and Philadelphia, have they require that the court assigns you like a public defender type person. I don't actually think they're called public defenders, but they have some name. You're assigned a lawyer to help you defend your case, which is great. It does certainly help, but all this could be avoided if we just took the step at first of just making sure that people weren't put in this situation in the first place, right? Getting lawyers to people is a Band-Aid where we could have just stopped us from getting the wound in the first place, right? It's not a great metaphor, but you get the general idea, right? It's not preventative. It's completely reactive in the way that it diagnoses, in the way that it fixes this problem. So anyway, so these are going to go through, and then what's going to happen is a lot of these people are going to lose, either because they don't have lawyers or because they actually can't pay rent, or for some other reason, right? There are lots of reasons that they can lose it. You may have had a job requirement or an income threshold requirement for you to be in your apartment. If you can no longer keep that up, they might have legal cause to throw you out on a contract claim, right? There are lots of kind of nuances in the law where landlords can chuck you out of your home, which is very unfortunate, and I wish we weren't there. But for those people who are going to be okay, myself included, thank heavens, we now need to be prepared to help out in any way we can, whether it's GoFundMes or other types of kind of reactive and mutual aid that we can do. The other thing we need to be aware of is now that all these people may not have homes, we are going to be in a situation where COVID can transmit wildly between all these people. Now, it's not entirely possible. It's entirely possible that, there's enough spread out, in the country that not all these people are in similar places can get COVID, but it's very hard to isolate when you don't have a place that you can call home to go to and to, quarantine in, right? And it costs cities lots of money for there to be more unhoused and homeless populations. So, we are going to suffer for this as a community, not least to say, obviously not as much to the people who are actually being thrown out of their places to live, but there are lots of consequences here that I don't think were considered before we kind of went down this path. So I know this segment has been a little long, and I'm explaining little things at a time here, but the thing to take away from this segment is the eviction moratorium as it wasn't particularly good, except for keeping people physically in their homes. When there was a chance to challenge the courts and to give people more time to find ways to stay in their homes, the Democratic Party and the White House failed. And now we are going to be in a process where over the course of the next few weeks and months, lots of people are going to be in situations where they're either being forced out of their homes or they're being forced to dip into their savings in order to save their ability to have a roof over their head. And all this could be avoided if we just did the right thing at first, but we didn't. And it's very frustrating that that's the case. But I hope I have given you a decent understanding of what's going on. Again, the eviction moratorium at the federal level expired today. Hopefully some states will step up to the plate and realize that not only is this just the right thing to do, but it's also important from a public health perspective to just keep people in their homes. I can't say that I'm particularly hopeful about that, but I have to hope against hope, as it were, and just see who steps up and tries to keep people in their homes, because we have until Monday when the courts reopen, and then evictions and foreclosures will start to go through, and people will have their lives upended, and it's just not good. There's nothing about this this inherently positive. So best of luck, I guess, to all those people out there who are struggling and who may need help. If you can look to see if your hometown has a community legal services office or the rough equivalent, see if there are real estate attorneys who do pro bono work, anything that you can do to get help. For those people who know people who are in this situation, please help them. Help them find attorneys, help them find community legal services or the equivalent, help them with their rent if you can. I know a lot of people are struggling right now, but if you know people who are in this position, please help them. If not just to keep them in their home, for all of us as a community to make sure that we reduce the spread of COVID-19 and its variants, and we keep as many people in their homes as possible. Thank you. So the next thing I want to talk about, equally depressing, unfortunately, is climate change, as I mentioned on last week's program, is here. We are stuck with climate change. There are lots of reports saying that the climate catastrophes that we are seeing, whether it's flooding, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and other types of things, will become more normal. Forest fires in places we never expected. Forest fires to be in, that's going to continue to happen. So, I talked a little bit last week about how we proceed. I want to take a step back this week and talk about climate change from a slightly different perspective, which is to say that climate change is going to be the new force of inequity and inequality in the world. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because I'm not sure there are a ton of people talking about it in general, but it is a really important topic, and I'm hoping that by kind of delving into it a little bit, I can get you to understand why it's not just, a dangerous thing for us generally, but it has these global impacts in ways that, will continue to perpetuate the inequities and the inequalities that we already see in our world, right? So the most obvious iteration of this is going to be that many of the countries who are not in the developed world are the ones who are bearing the brunt of climate change going on. Now, obviously, in the developed world, we are experiencing climate change. That is not, this is not to say that it only affects those in the underdeveloped world. But if you think about it, in the developed world, we are likely to have the ability to mitigate some of the harm, whether it's to build levees quickly or to have the resources to move people out of dangerous areas and not to disrupt people's lives too much more than they already have been. But if you think about the underdeveloped world, not only are there not necessarily national resources there, but a lot of these countries are not necessarily as politically and economically stable as some of the developed world is, and that leads to a variety of issues, including the inability to formulate a holistic response to any climate disaster. So specifically, I'm talking about South Sudan right now. So they had a bunch of flooding in the last couple of weeks. I mentioned it last week on the show, and people essentially were not able to rely on their local governments or even their national government to get them help, because there just wasn't a level of organization there. There wasn't a level of excess resources there to be mobilized. So compare this, where lots of people are just trying to kind of salvage things on their own and they're trying to deal with this on their own, with what's happening in Germany and Belgium right now. So when these floods came through Germany and Belgium, the entirety of Germany's police force, national police force, was mobilized, their military was mobilized, there were helicopters and military vehicles and resources brought from all over Germany and concentrated in these areas to either help rescue people, to get rid of to pump out the water, to try and save people's valuables, to try and save people's homes, and just to perform these kind of damage mitigation procedures that would have helped the people who were affected, right? And Belgium, the same thing. Huge amounts of resources were organized. And by the way, this is because these countries have stable governments and they have excess resources. Now, of course, if you think about this from a historical perspective, it kind of makes sense why this is the case, right? Countries in the developed world have often been the exploiters of countries in the underdeveloped world, right? And that exploitation has taken the resources that were naturally there, has destabilized the institutions that were naturally there, and transferred all of that wealth and stability over to what we now know as the developed world, right? This is kind of the fallout of colonialism, imperialism, and kind of all the other bad isms that occurred between like the 1600s and 1900s, 1600s and like 2000s, if we're being real. And some of this exploitation still goes on, right? But so so that was a huge driver of inequality, because it creates these situations where some countries have a lot more wealth than others, and when there are catastrophes. And again, as I said earlier, these catastrophes are not just affecting one part of the world or another part of the world. These catastrophes are affecting us all over the world, developed, underdeveloped, semi-developed, whatever. But at the end of the day, those countries who have more resources, who are able to invest more resources in prevention, who are able to invest more resources in risk remediation, once they have actually had the disaster and resettle people and what have you, those countries are going to be much better off, and those people who live in those countries will be much better off than in a country like South Sudan, where Al Jazeera had interviewed a woman whose house had effectively floated away, and she was just desperately trying to get out whatever she could, but there was no large mobilization of resources there. Now, that may have changed since that interview, but at the time, it was difficult because the whole town was essentially washed away, and there wasn't much that the surrounding area was able to do because the resources simply weren't there. And this is occurring all over the place. In China, when there was flooding, there was lots of resources available, right? When there was, major flooding in the United States, and although Katrina was more or less botched, there were lots of resources that were able to be mobilized, right? People were able to come in, and so essentially the point I'm trying to make here is that it used to be that exploitation and colonialism and imperialism were the forms of inequalities, were the root causes of iniquities between nation states. And although that holds true, climate change is going to make it worse, because for every disaster that climate change wreaks on underdeveloped nations, they will become further underdeveloped, right? Any progress that they made in their development will be hampered. Whereas in the developed world, we will have the resources available to actually not allow ourselves on a large scale to become, to kind of lose our developed status through, as these disasters roll on. So I think it's just important to think about from an economic and historical perspective about what is going on as far as climate change's effects on other countries. What we're benefiting from, right? We obviously understand our place in history as benefiting from the cruelties of the past. Even if you had nothing to do with the exploitation, you are benefiting from it, right? If you're in a developed country. So this is just one of the things we have to think about when we advocate for preventative measures in developed countries. We're not necessarily doing it for ourselves entirely. We're also doing it for our brethren in other countries for whom we have already robbed of the ability to do prevention, right? We are fighting to make sure that, we're reducing the impact of climate change not because necessarily it will help us, and it will, mind you, but also, and more importantly, because it's going to help those people for whom we have taken away the ability to do the preventative measures on their own. All right. All right. I have one more climate change topic I want to talk about today a little bit, and then I promise we will stop talking about climate change. We'll talk about something else. But climate change is super important, obviously, so I want to devote as much time as possible to that when it's relevant. So last week on the show, and again this week a little bit, I have talked about the flooding and some of the natural disasters that are becoming more frequent as we go forward. You may know that last year in January, a town called Paradise burnt to the ground in California. Recently in British Columbia, a small town, I think it's called Littleton, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So if you're a Canadian and I got that wrong, please correct me in the comments. Thank you very much, and I'll make a correction. But this town also burnt to the ground. In Germany, buildings and businesses have washed away. You know, there's all these other issues going on where climate change is creating immense amount of damage. So most of the time we think about damage to stuff as being, you know, stuff is replaceable, human lives aren't, right? That's typically the mantra, save a life first. Whatever the stuff is, it can be replaced. And that continues to be true. This segment is not meant to dispel of that notion. However, it's important to know that as disasters continue to befall us, we're going to start to run into a very interesting problem, which is insurance is going to die as an industry. So what does that mean? Effectively, what I'm talking about is we're going to get to a point where the cost of replacing things becomes too high for insurance companies to exist, or they will just raise premiums to the point where no one can afford them except the rich. We will get to a point where the forces of capitalism push us to a point where it becomes it's no longer profitable to be an insurance company. And actually, we saw a little bit of this last year. So during the wildfires in California in 2020, there was a huge scandal. I believe this was the PG&E fire that consumed the town of Paradise. The insurance companies were breaking their contracts with people because they believed it would be cheaper for them to go to court than to actually pay out the amount that people were asking for. So remember, insurance companies only keep so much money around. The idea about insurance is that we all pay in, and that, you know, one person or two people out of, say, 100 might need the insurance at any time. They take a large payout, but the insurance company continues to make money because most of the people are not pulling out of the system at the same time. It's like a run on the banks. If you know what happened in 1929, when the stock market collapsed, right? Everyone went to their banks, tried to pull their money out, and of course that system collapsed too. So it's essentially the same thing as a run on the banks, it's a run on insurance companies. When there are whole communities that are devastated all at the same time, like in the town of Paradise or Littleton in Canada, or even in Germany and Belgium where the flooding was by the Rhine, insurance companies are not going to be able to pay out because they just don't have enough money on hand to pay out. So they will try and break their contracts, or they'll file for bankruptcy, or they'll do something to avoid it. And as this continues to happen, and as disasters affect more and more people and more businesses, all of whom are insured through a very small number of companies, we're going to get to a point where it's no longer profitable for insurance to be a private entity. And as that continues to happen, we're going to get to a place where insurance becomes so expensive that only the rich can afford it, or insurance is just going to die out altogether and we start relying on our own personal vestiges of wealth to prevent the type of long-term harm that can be caused when there's a disaster that we are suddenly, in the middle of. What is most likely to happen is that governments are going to have to step in where insurance carriers cannot, because obviously the point of a government is to protect its citizens. One of the things that the government will have to protect its citizens from will be climate change. And as people are forced to relocate and move, and as they lose large amounts of property, and insurance companies are not able or willing to pay, it will come down to governments who will start to have to bear the burden of this. And by the way, this is more or less an inevitability. We should be thinking about this now. We should be thinking about either putting money away or for this type of thing, having like a national insurance of some kind, or just, preparing our emergency government agencies to, have the type of capital on hand or have the ability to procure the capital needed to essentially go about large-scale insurance from a government perspective where it's essentially safe because of the way that governments typically work. And by the way, we're going to get to a point as well where this amount of insurance being created is going to start to challenge governments who don't subscribe to modern monetary theory or are not able to, right? They share a currency with other people and are not able to print their currency, or they can't rely on fiat currency because their economy is weak or what have you, right? But because we kind of know in advance that this is what's likely to happen, we can prepare for it now. I think it bears restating because of how stark it is. Insurance as a private industry is going to die. It is inevitable. It will happen eventually as climate change gets worse, as disasters become more frequent, as insurance companies are required to pay more and more claims because of the amount of disasters that are happening. Insurance will become a venture for either only the rich, or it will become impossible to maintain as a private capitalist venture in general, and it will just die as an industry. And where the gap is left, people will have to find different ways to make sure that they can recover from whatever it is that climate change throws at them. As I mentioned last week on the show, we are no longer in the point where prevention of climate change is realistic. We are now in the adaptation phase. We must now adapt the way that we live to prevent further climate change damage, but also to recover from the amount of climate change damage that we will begin to experience. Summers will become hotter. Hurricanes will become more dangerous. There was a tornado in Philadelphia just very recently. There haven't been large dangerous tornadoes in Pennsylvania for almost 200 years. We are starting to see these disasters pick up in scope, in frequency, in dangerousness, and as we adapt to the climate essentially reacting to what we've done to it over the past couple hundred years, we need to realize that the way that we do business, and I mean literal business in this case because of insurance, it is just not tenable any longer. But because we can see this coming and we have some sense of what will happen in the future, we can prepare. So I urge people to start talking about this, especially the left should start talking about the notion of nationalized insurance of some kind, that we should be talking about the nationalizing insurance industries to make sure that when climate change affects us as individuals, there is some entity or organization there that's able to save us from catastrophe, or else we're going to be in a lot more difficult of a position than we would have been otherwise. And again, this is all because we will not be able to rely on insurance. So I don't know what necessarily the perfect answer is. I think nationalizing insurance as an entity and having it paid through tax is probably the best way to do it, but I'm sure there are people who disagree. By the way, if you do disagree and you have a thought on this that doesn't agree with mine, or you think for some reason that my assessment about the insurance industry dying is wrong, please leave a comment. I'm happy to respond to it on the next show, or even just in the comment section. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Okay, so that's the end of that. So I want to move away from climate change, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of the economy as a whole. And this is going to be a little bit of a dense section, so hopefully I can explain everything well enough. If I don't, obviously leave me a comment. I would love to make corrections if they are necessary. And also I want to make sure that everything I'm explaining is done in a way that is accessible to as many people as possible. So if you feel I'm not doing that, please let me know, and I will take your commentary to heart and do better next time. So I want to talk about the difference between private solutions and public solutions. So from a macroeconomic perspective, which is to say, looking at the economy as a large, as from a heightened view. So like looking at the national economy or looking at the economy of a state or something like that is instead of, a smaller way. So macroeconomically, we have divided up the things that we need to survive into public goods and private goods. And we have tended in the last 40 years or so, pretty much since the death of the New Deal, to favor these private solutions. It's an ideology called neoliberalism, where essentially you take systemic problems and you privatize the solution so that individual entities or organizations can profit off of that in maintenance and furtherance of the capitalist economic model, which of course concentrates, is meant to concentrate wealth in the hands of entrepreneurs who are deemed to be rewarded for their ability to innovate with the economy, keep the economy moving, and things like that. So, just a basic background. So, what is a private solution? So, essentially, a private solution says that we have a problem, and in order for that problem to best be resolved, it makes sense for an individual or a group of individuals to attempt to compete with other individuals or groups of individuals in order to, create a solution to the problem. Say, for example, the problem is there aren't good enough sandals. The sandals that are being made right now don't provide enough ventilation. People are getting foot funguses. It's just not nice, right? So one of the ways that you can solve this problem is to say that it is essentially to say from a theoretical perspective that, well, because the sandals that are currently being manufactured are not serving people well, at some point someone's going to come along with a sandal design that actually solves the problem that of the ventilation and the foot fungus, and they will start to sell a sandal like this. And because this sandal solves the problem that so many other sandals don't, that don't resolve, people will change their behavior and buy this new sandal because it solves the problem that they were having before with ventilation and foot fungus, right? That's a private solution to a problem. And obviously, I just made all that up, but you get the general idea, right? The private solutions are typically best done for things that don't really have too much effect on, whether individuals live or die and stuff like that. Whereas a public solution, let's say to a large scale problem. Evictions. It's totally unrelated. I'm not taking this from an earlier story or anything. So say, there's a pandemic going on, and all these people are, they lost their jobs because all these places had to close down for quarantine, and we decide that we're going to stop people from getting evicted. And then for some reason, we are going to let that expire. And, we say to people, well, we are going to, instead of making it so, back rent or whatever isn't a thing, and we just kind of wipe the slate clean and people can start over, we're going to say, well, we're going to say that, we'll give you some resource to help you fight your eviction claim. So in that situation, I've given you two examples. So the public solution would be saying, hey, actually, we're just going to wipe the slate clean, right? We're going to say that there is no back rent. We're going to say that the property taxes that were due during that time are nullified. We are going to provide enough money to the banks so that they can nullify the mortgage payments that were due, right? You just eliminate all the portions of the chain that were causing the problem. And the reason this is a public solution is because you're using a collectivized decision-making unit to execute the problem, right? To get rid of the problem. It's also a preventative one, but that's a little different. So in my other example, which is the state paying for lawyers for people who need evictions, this is also a public solution. You get to a point where you recognize that individuals are going to be in a difficult place if the collective body, typically the government, is not able to create some sort of solution. So the solution becomes, hey, we're actually going to pay for lawyers for all these people who are getting evicted. Now, I would argue that this is a reactive solution, but it's still a public solution because on a macroeconomic scale, the organization, the public entity, the government, who is making decisions about what a solution might be and executing those solutions for a problem, whether it's a public problem or a private problem, right? So that's the difference between public and private solutions. So essentially, oftentimes in neoliberalism and in late stage capitalism, as it were right now, we are kind of propagandized is not the right term, but it's pretty adjacent to what I'm talking about. To think about, every time there's a problem, there should be a private solution. Climate change is actually a really great example of this, right? We're trying to rely on private companies to come up with the tech that is going to, help save us from climate change. We're relying on the actions of individual people. These are also private solutions, right? To say to people, hey, you should recycle more, you shouldn't use plastic straws, you should use this, you should do that. To individuals, that is a private solution, not because private individuals are profiting off it, but because private individuals are changing their behavior. Whereas a public solution is either going to have a large organization, usually a government, go forth and create a solution, or they're going to just say that actually, instead of requiring individuals to do something, we as a collective are going to do something, change our collective behavior as a government or nation state or whatever, in order to solve the problem. So there's kind of two prongs of each different type. So the reason I wanted to talk about this was because, as we move forward and we start to see more issues come up, I think we should be aware of the types of messaging that we're getting from people who are invested in the system as it is now, which is to say, what can you do to solve blank, instead of, or how can people innovate out of blank crisis? Where we should be thinking about, what can the government do for us? What can we do as a collective to solve the problem? Because oftentimes, especially for these larger problems, it is going to take collective action in order to make sure that we get out of these crises in a way that is inherently positive for everyone involved, whereas private solutions not only typically don't work for large-scale problems, but also, even if they do work, it again concentrates the wealth. It concentrates the wealth gained from that in the hands of a very small number of people, who then are able to exploit us for our inability to adapt without them, right? So they use their innovation, their power, because they own the private solution. And depending on how available the private solution is, they can create winners and losers, because at the end of the day, it's their product, they own it, and they can decide how it's sold, who it's sold to, how much it's sold for, and what have you. And this is especially problematic where there are issues that affect large communities, and especially when some of those large communities don't have a ton of resources, because you start to reinforce the inequities that we have seen that come from a variety of different issues. So as we go through our daily lives, as we realize large collective problems, as we see the types of issues that we're facing as a community, either in your community or other communities, just think about the types of solutions that are being offered for these problems, and think about whether it makes sense to have a public solution or a private solution for the thing that you are experiencing. I would argue, from my personal perspective as a socialist, that most of the time, many of the problems that we have are going to be best solved with public solutions. But I'm sure there are arguments out there for why some public problems should be resolved by private actors. But my bias, as it were, is to see public solutions for these problems, because I think it is easiest to move forward with something and to bring everyone with you when there is collective action, collective decision making, and collective resource use for the solving of a particular problem. So anyway, I hope this was enlightening as to what the difference between private solutions and public solutions are, what neoliberalism is, how it works in hand with late stage capitalism, and gives you an understanding of what to look for either in the media or just even when you're talking to people about what their biases are about, how communities solve problems. So the last issue I want to talk about today, and it's a little late. I know I'm a little late to this party, but I still want to talk about it. I think it's really important. So recently there were protests in Cuba. They got a lot of coverage in the United States. There were support protests in favor of the protesters in Cuba in some cities in Florida. I believe there was I think the largest one was in Miami. There's a large Cuban population there. And then shortly afterwards, there were a bunch of counter-protests, or what was called pro-revolutionary protests that took place, more or less in defense of and in support of the government. And the takes that were given by individuals and by media figures was kind of an interesting grab bag of nonsense. Obviously, they're not all wrong, and I think some of them did make good points. But I want to give you my perspective on this, and I just kind of want to dispel the notion that all of this is being cultivated by one thing. And I want to give you kind of the other side of it too, why the dynamics have changed recently and things like that. So let's step back a couple of weeks ago, shall we, for when these protests were first starting. Originally, they were now, mind you, Cuba obviously has been a state enemy of the United States for a very long time. The United States has an economic embargo against Cuba. The United States maintains that embargo to this day. They work with other nations to maintain the embargo, and they punish nations who violate the embargo. So, this more or less is an embargo that not only extends from the United States, but also all of its allies and all the other nation states for whom the United States bears some level of influence, right? So just a little bit of context there. The United States has attempted to overthrow the communist government of Cuba multiple times. The most disastrous of these was the Bay of Pigs invasion. I think Fidel Castro's life was threatened something like 600 times by various intelligence forces tied to or allied with the United States. And, there was just kind of all this stuff going on. So originally, there was a democratically elected individual whose name I'm blanking on, who was running Cuba. The United States did not like them. So the United States overthrew them and installed Batista, who was a US-friendly dictator that ruled with an iron fist. And then the Communist Revolution came, and Fidel Castro led his band of guerrillas to take over, guerrilla fighters, not like apes, but like people who hide in bushes and stuff. Guerrilla fighters to take over the country, and then they began a program of nationalizing large numbers of resources, and taking land away from the rich and ostensibly giving it to the poor, or giving it to the government. Okay, there have been issues with that. There have been places where land has been taken and it was not redistributed. There are places where government officials have made lots of personal wealth, right? So the system obviously wasn't executed perfectly, but this is more or less what was happening there as they went forward. And because of this ostensible alignment with the communist ideology during the Cold War, when the United States was fighting for capitalism in the world, there was a large amount of frustration and animosity between the United States and Cuba, not least because of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, which made the United States very nervous because there was a threat of nuclear weapons being stored in Cuba on behalf of the Soviet Union. So there's a lot going on here. But so we're going to fast forward a little bit to a couple weeks ago when these protests started to erupt in Cuba. Now, primarily, these protests have been about food, about medicine. There's been lots of problems in Cuba recently about the distribution of food and medicine. with concerns that not enough food and medicine is coming into the country. This is especially problematic because there's a pandemic going on, as you all know. So, there were lots of protests going on, and these protests eventually started to become anti-government protests, which, by the way, makes perfect sense, right? If you are in a situation where, your basic needs are not being met, you are going to protest the people in power, because in theory, and in most cases, they have the ability to kind of alleviate that burden on you in some way, shape, or form. And so it makes perfect sense for the protests to become anti-government protests, to say, hey, I'm mad at the government because I can't eat and I can't get medicine. Now, the way it was reported on in the United States is that these were pro-capitalist, anti-communist, protesters, and the Biden administration stands with them, and the Cuban people are making their decision, and they're showing that communism doesn't work. And there was a whole bunch of capitalist propaganda that was used to report on these. And mind you, some of the root causes of it you can say come from communism if you want. I don't think that's true, and I think I've laid out why you can't necessarily tie together the ideology and the government, right? If the government poorly executes the ideology, it's hard to say that the ideology is to blame. I think that's the case in all countries, right? But I digress. So shortly after these protests were going on, I think about 2 weeks later, the government called on its supporters and said, hey, we see these people in the streets, they're getting lots of press coverage. Could you all please go in the streets and, show that you support the government? Can you do pro-government protests? And so there were lots of demonstrators came, and they waved Cuban flags, and they sang songs of the revolution, and they were very much in favor of the revolution. These protests didn't get as much coverage. However, something else, another dynamic started to go forward, which was the anti-government protests started to die down. Now, that didn't get a ton of coverage either, but what did get a ton of coverage, and justifiably so, was the fact that the government was starting to crack down on these protests, ostensibly because they didn't like the coverage they were getting. So they used the military to crack down a little bit on these anti-government protests. And by the way, don't do that. It's a terrible idea. And typically it only makes protests worse. But in this case, it did seem to make these protesters go away. Now, that being said, I am sure that the grievances that they were feeling and originally having to do with food and medicine still exist. So if you happen to be the Cuban government and you're watching this, even if those people are not ideologically aligned with you, you should help them because they're in your country and they are your responsibility whether you like them or not. By the way, that's the same way in every country. Regardless of how you feel about your government or the regime or the ideology to which it ascribes, you should be aware that we are operating as national units for the most part, and we need to make sure that as long as we continue to operate in these national units and use this method of resource collection and distribution, you are then responsible for all of the individuals in your care. So if you're the communist government of Cuba and you don't like the capitalist protesters, that's fine. You don't have to like them. You do have to make sure they have access to food. You do have to make sure they have access to medicine. And you do need to not use your military against them because that makes you look like authoritarian thugs. Like any country looks when it uses its military against its own people, whether that is capitalist, communist, feudal, whatever, right? Just it's not good. So don't do that. But I think the point of all this is to say, and I've given you a decent chunk of timeline here. I've given you a lot of events that have gone on. I've given all the context that I can give essentially here. And what I'll say at the end of the day is, it is perfectly rational to report on protests, right? It gets clicks, it gets views. Media typically moves towards confrontational things because it's exciting, right? It gets people, it gets eyeballs, and a lot of news is ratings driven nowadays, so it totally makes sense. I'm not criticizing the coverage of the protest whatsoever, but you need to look at it from a grander perspective. Why isn't there food and medicine in Cuba? Well, it probably has to do in no small part to the fact that many countries are not able to give food to Cuba, are not able to give medicine to Cuba, and are not allowed to trade with Cuba, right? So Cuba is trying to maintain itself on whatever resources it can create on its own. And do so without being reliant on any other governments, because most governments are not going to have the ability to get around US and allied sanctions. So we're dealing with a country that primarily is trying to fend for itself, to generate its food and medicine on its own. And mind you, it has typically done a good job of that. But like all situations, it falls on hard times. You can get a bad crop. Some medicine can spoil. There are small little disasters that can happen, which can have large consequences if you don't have some level of reserves, or if you don't have the ability to import reserves from other countries. And Cuba does not have this ability. So if it was a natural disaster, or it was a man-made disaster that caused for food and medicine to be in less supply than usual, it makes sense for people to protest. But the context that has to be given for these protests is that part of the reason that the food and medicine is not available is because it cannot be brought in from other countries. And it cannot be brought in from other countries because the United States and its allies have a trade embargo on Cuba and have had for the last 60 years. We made some great progress under the Obama administration, who tried to resolve their quandary with Cuba and allow Cuba to trade with the US and for people to go there and what have you, to send money back and such. Trump undid all of that. And by the way, he shouldn't have. We should go back to peaceable relations with Cuba and allow them to have access to food and medicine. And look, at the end of the day, if we get to a point where Cuba, on its own, without American help or influence, or without help and influence from other countries, decides to shift back from a communist model of government, of economic exchange, to a capitalist model of economic exchange, then okay, so be it, right? And capitalists can say it was a communist experiment that failed, and there are lots of there are lots of people who are going to be able to tut about it. Fine, you can win about that. I don't really care. But the thing is, the point is to allow the Cuban people to do this on their own, to not be influenced by the United States or by economic impositions that are put on by the United States and its allies. The Cuban people have the right, just like any other people around the world, to make decisions for themselves. And if you're reporting on this protest and on these protests against the government as if the only people who are stopping the Cubans from making their own decisions is the government of that country, you're engaging in journalistic malpractice and you don't know what you're talking about. There are lots of contextual clues and important information that you can give in order to show the true context of what's going on there. And if you don't do that, you're merely playing for an ideological team. In this segment, I tried to give you all the information I possibly could that I'm aware of that is going on. I gave you my perspective, and I hope that you take that to inform your perspective. I had to say things that weren't exactly in line with my ideology. And you know what? That's fine. But I told you the facts as I knew them, and I gave you my perspective, which honestly is, the best thing I can do to give you as objective to be open, not objective, but to be open and honest and transparent about who I am, where I'm coming from, and what the information is. So I hope that we get better media coverage for things like this in the future. I'm not necessarily confident in that, but I did just want to take some time to talk about the protests in Cuba, to talk about what the root causes of those are, and to give you a sense of what can be done to make this situation better, which is first, foremost, primary, and maybe only to lift the embargo. All right, so I'm sure you all heard that. That is our timer. So we are back. Excuse me. We are back. It has been an hour. If you are coming back to us from the break and you just took an hour and went and took a nap somewhere or something, welcome back. If you stay with us to the politics section, I don't need to welcome you back because you're already here. But it doesn't matter. We are back, and we're going to check on our bread and see how it's risen. So let's take a look. Okay, I was going to do a big reveal, but I think you probably saw. Ta-da! All right. So as you can see, our bread is definitely more than doubled in size. It's very impressive. So what we're going to do now is we are going to shape our bread. So this week, I am happy to share that we are going to be making a 5-braid challah this week. It is a beautiful, beautiful bread. I mean, challah is a beautiful bread in general, but so what we're going to do is we're just going to take this and just put a little bit of flour down, just teeny, teeny, tiny bit here. So we're going to take our dough, we're going to, whoop, there we go. Let's just put this over here, shall we? All right. All right, so we're going to quickly knead this back into a ball. Remember, it's going to rise a second time, so if you knock the air out of it, no big deal. We just kind of want to get it back in ball form, make it easy to work with. And once it's kind of back in one singular mass, and it's the right shape for you, obviously just use your hands and create that nice little ball shape. Again, we're going to weigh it, and we're going to divide this by 5 evenly. We're going to roll these out into strips, and then we're going to create our 5-strand challah. I'm going to show you how to do it. It's a lot of fun, and you can pretty much use this method for any challah braid larger than 4. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. We're probably not going to make, any challah braid larger than 4 that is an odd number. Now, mind you, just a reminder, the more braids you use, the more squarular, word I just invented, your challah is going to be. So just keep that in mind. Oh, perfect. All right, so this is about 55 ounces here, which divides very nicely into 5. So we're just going to try and create 11-ounce pieces. Nope, not quite. So just go through, divide your dough into 5, more or less evenly, pieces, evenly weighted pieces. And if you have to do like multiples like I've done, just take all your dough and give it a quick knead, and it'll go back to being one nice little ball. Set that aside. I'm going to do that 4 more times until we have 5 balls of dough. Okay. It's this way. Okay, perfect. I'm just going to take a little bit off that. I did the math in my head a little wrong. Okay. So, right. Okay, perfect. So about 11. Then we're going to take this one here, do the same thing. Again, don't worry if they look weird. You're going to just, they're going to get reshaped anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much if they look kind of weird. Perfect. That was actually almost totally perfect. It was 11:01. All right. Let's divide this in half. Nope. Come on, add a little bit at a time here. Close enough. 11:04. And just to check this one. All right. So we have our 5 balls of dough here. All right. So what we're going to do with each of those, let me just put this over here, is we are going to roll these out into, we're done with our scale, by the way, but not our plastic, so don't throw your plastic away. All right, so we are going to, and we're probably also done with this too, our slicer. So if you want to chuck that in your sink, you can do that. And actually, I'm going to just do that real quick. All right, so we're going to roll each of these into a nice long log, preferably an inch to an inch and a half thick. You want to roll these fairly long. We're thinking like at least 1.5 feet, 2 feet here. It will not actually be that long when it is being braided. So just remember, it will shrink a little bit. So if these, and also it'll just shrink a little bit from being a nice elastic dough that we've worked. So don't worry about you know, if it feels too long or what have you, it's going to be just fine. Actually, let me put this over here because we're going to bring our tray over. I'm using a, what is this? An 17 by 11 inch tray here for my bread. It's the same one I use every week, but I just give you the measurement. So just 5 strands, pretty much like that. So I'd say it's about 1.5 feet long. You can do yours longer if you want a longer challah. Just make sure there's some girth to them, right? You want to make sure that you have a bread that's nice sized for sandwiches or whatever other purpose you are interested in making your bread for. As I divulged on this show multiple times, I use my bread primarily for sandwiches and toast. So I try and get a bread that's tall enough that it fits in the toaster. Tall enough and thin enough that it fits in the toaster. All right. That one can actually probably use a little bit more encouraging. So let's just give that. If you want, but you don't have to, just taper the ends a little bit. This will allow you to make sure that your ends are smaller than that, that your challah doesn't bulge on the end. This will make it look prettier. We will actually taper ours as we stretch it out. So that's why I'm not doing it here. But if you want, you can see it, there's a little cone on the end here. If you want to create a little cone on the end of your bread to taper it off, you are welcome to do that. And it may work better for you. So obviously, you're going to know what works best for your rolling process. You're going to know better than I am anyway, especially because you're sitting with your bread and I'm sitting with mine. So we're just going to go through until we have them the size and shape that we want. Let's roll that one out a little bit more. And by the way, this kind of guessing and checking and seeing what works is perfectly natural, perfectly normal, not a problem at all. All right, we've got 3 down. Let's do our 2 more. Yeah, it's going to be closer to our normal segment length, I think. Oh, one more thing. If you have little pockets of air, you are free to pop those. Remember, these are going to rise another time. So don't worry too much about that. All right. The other thing you want to make sure you do is just make sure that your braids are pretty much all the same width and length. This will help with the shaping of your challah. It will make it look nicer. And it won't look so weird. And by the way, the other thing is too, if they are the same length, what's going to happen is when you get to the end of the bread and you're starting to pinch off the ends, it won't look so like artificially slapped together. All right, so we have our 5. So we're going to arrange them in the following pattern. Okay, we're going to put 3 on one side here, and we're going to put 2 on the other. So, yeah. And the reason we're doing this is to make it easier for us to braid. So we're going to take our ends here and just stretch them up, attach them all together. This is going to be our one end. Don't worry, it looks ugly now, but it won't. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to swing this end over and then underneath that one. So I'll show you again because I was kind of fast. So you're going to take the one. So there are the 3 side and the 2 side, right? So take the braid on the 3 side, the one that's farthest away from you on the outside, put it over the braid next to it, and underneath the braid in the middle. So if you get a gap that's forming there, just make sure that your braids are close enough together that there is no gap in there. That gap will show in the final product, in the baked bread, so you don't want to do that. And you want to keep this nice and tight. And we're going to do that again, outside, over, and then under. 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 And you can see now, because we're keeping this nice and tight, that we actually have a nice little braid going. So that should start to look really nice. And just keep doing that as long as you can until you run out of bread. And so this is going to be our last one here. So over under. And so you can see I kind of have 5 little nubs at the end. We're just going to stretch those and bring them together and just push them down at the end. And then we're going to tuck that end under. And on this side, we've done the same thing. We're going to tuck that end under. So you should have, and we're just going to bring this together here a little bit. So you should have now, and I'll show you on the tray as soon as I put it down. So you should have a lovely challah that looks a little bit like this. How about that? All right, so that's really beautiful. It's going to puff up again, so don't worry about what it looks like right now. It's going to puff up. It's going to double in size. We're going to cover it again with our plastic. If your plastic was not big enough, you know, feel free to get more. Yeah, this is the side with the oil on it. There we go. Right, yeah. Right. So I just turned mine 45 degrees so the long ends are there. This is going to double in size. We're going to set another timer for an hour. We're going to do all of this off camera, and then once it is ready, oops, that's fine. All right, so I'm putting a towel over it. Sorry, I cut myself off there, but I put a towel over it. You want to kind of tuck the towel underneath a little bit, just so you keep the heat in, but not too much because we want the bread to have room to grow. All right, so now we have set a timer for an hour. When this is done, what you're going to do is you are going to make sure it's doubled in bulk. If not, just keep rising it until it's doubled in size. At this point, there's really nothing else you can do to it except for just let it rise. At that point, or when you feel it's ready, we're going to set our ovens to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Once we have done that, we are going to take our egg. Now, you can use an egg yolk, you can use an egg white, you can use milk, you can use water to paint our crust. Just a reminder, if you use a whole egg or an egg yolk, you're going to get that nice golden brown color on your challah. If you use egg white, your bread will be shiny, but it won't be golden brown. If you use milk, you will have a shiny crust, but also a hard crust. And if you use water, you're not going to have the golden brown color like you will with egg, but you will have a very nice hard crust if you prefer to have a harder crust on your bread. So milk and water give you a harder crust. Milk is going to give you the extra sheen and the harder crust, not the golden brown for either of those. Egg, egg yolk, whole egg and egg yolk is going to give you golden brown and a sheen. And egg white is going to give you a sheen, but no golden brown color. You'll just get a regular brown bread color. Okay? And once you do that, you're going to put your bread in the oven for 35 minutes, rotating at about 17.5 minutes or about halfway. When it's done, you will know because it will look golden brown and delicious. But also, when you knock on it with your knuckles, it will sound hollow. If you have a thermometer, and I highly recommend you get one because it is the best way to tell if your challah is done, I highly recommend using that. In the thickest part of the bread, when it's cooked, put your thermometer in and wait for it to hit 205 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, you will know your bread is fully cooked. It can get as high as 210. It is technically close to done at 200. It will continue to cook as it cools. So if for some reason you can't get above 200, that's fine. But really you're aiming for that 205 number, okay? And that is it for this week. As I mentioned earlier, we have a very special surprise coming next week, and I cannot wait to show you. Once things are confirmed, I will let you know. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.